Good morning or good afternoon. For you, it's good night, right, Jenny, in Australia?
It's evening, that's right. Yes, so nice to see you.
Yes, I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that you are bringing your experience to this research. It's very important that you bring your voice from Australia, from all the part of the continent. We'll start by introducing what this research is about, and of course, we'll follow up with questions. And then the idea is to be a conversation between your experience and how it resonates with the research exploration and ideas that we're looking for. So, of course, I'm asking you the permission to record and also making sure that you have seen all the privacy notice, the information about the project, and I just received your consent form.
Great, good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's fine. That's great. Well, this research is to investigate how can museums incorporate regenerative frameworks, regenerative principles, perhaps to transform their core function and their strategic thinking to become more effective in an ethical catalyst for society to mitigate and adapt to climate and social issues, but also to have more long-term thinking on social and environmental issues. The project then it's looking into how museums practitioners are working in different ways, but also reflecting on regenerative practices. And what I will do now is to go through a little bit just the basics or ideas that you have seen that I have sent about regenerative thinking, and then see how it resonates to your experience.
Good.
So just to make sure I'm saying here the right and correct way, Jen Newell is the curator for climate change at the Australian Museum, and she also managed the Australian Museum's Climate Solution Center.
That's right.
Right? I'm Lucimara Letelier. I'm a researcher at the Museum Studies program at Leicester University. So, Jenny, the regenerative movement is an invitation for us to think beyond sustainability and also to embrace an eco lenses in everything we do, and inviting institutions to start regenerating territories, values, and principles that will help us perhaps to create not only restoration of the nature that has been damaged, but also possibility of reconcile and restoring processes that are in place that are continuously degeneratively committing our resources to our future. So I want to start asking if you believe that by incorporating these principles in museums, we can perhaps help museums to learn how to design as nature. And how do you think this could add some values on the way museums are creating mitigation adaptation to the climate and social crisis?
Oh, very good question. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking me. It goes right to the heart of what I think museums really need to be stepping up to. And I think there's a tendency in museums now to be only just starting to approach sustainability and thinking about what we might say to the public. And many museums aren't even doing that. So I think there's still there's a lot of tentative behaviour and sort of holding back from really engaging in the climate and biodiversity crisis. And if a museum or a gallery is actually thinking about what to do about the climate crisis, they tend to be just thinking about their own operations and being more sustainable in their own operations. So it's quite curtailed, and they're not thinking more holistically about the role of the museum in its community and the role as a trusted source of information and leadership, thought leadership, or even just education for all generations. And so there's a lot that needs to be done, but I think offering up the idea of regenerative principles is really powerful, and it is where we need to be thinking in the museum sector, the cultural institution sector. I would love for more of our colleagues to be aware of that, that, and also like to be able to be activated by those ideas, activated and inspired, and to have that, that real sense of optimism about what can happen. Like, yes, we need to not just be thinking about sustainability. We actually need to think about what we can regenerate and what we can, as important institutions within our communities, how we can help our communities to live well, and our fellow species to prosper, and our part in nature to be a supportive one, and one of stewardship, and not of depletion and destruction. And that's really exciting to me. I think that's just fantastic. And I think the more we can talk to our colleagues about regeneration, the better. And I think part of what's been happening is that some of us have been really captivated by thinking about what can happen with regenerating our world, and it's not really being, like, it's not a common narrative yet. I think in most societies. I don't know, I don't really know enough, but I'm sure you've been studying it in more depth than I have, and I haven't really been studying. I've just been picking up what's in the ether. It seems there's not the really good, strong conversations out there in the media, or in the creative industries, and maybe even in academia. I'm not sure, but I just sense that we need more hearty conversations, more robust conversations about regeneration, and to inspire people of all walks of life. Not just through museums, but in all walks of life. We need to have people to be really understanding all of
Can I just say, if you can get a little bit your mic louder than it is, I'm not sure if you can equalize it to be a little bit louder. I think it would be helpful. Your voice is becoming lower. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's so critical what you're saying, Jenny. The idea of the research is to bring the regenerative community closer to the museums community. Regeneration is not a new concept. It's an ancestor knowledge. Of course, it comes from nature itself and from the indigenous knowledge. But we all know we are in the Anthropocene era, and people may not understand quite easily how does it apply to management systems in institutions. So regenerative thinkers and authors in the last 20 years to 30 years, they have systematized process, principles, and frameworks that help people who are leading institutions to learn how living principles apply to management systems. And at first, it seems to be difficult to think of, but it's basically the idea that around seven principles of living principles can apply in the way we look at projects, we look at territories, we look at cities, we look at neighborhoods. And it could be there anyway, because we are living bodies and entities, but we may have forgotten. So it's just bringing an openness for us to relearn of what regeneration is. So I think I can recap with you. The regenerative paradigm, it's inviting us to leave the extractive paradigm, and also to understand that it's not enough just to do less harm and to do more good. So if you think about sustainability as less harm, we think about sustainable development as more good, and then we think about regeneration as regenerating the territories and going beyond just the idea of doing good because the systems are telling us to do so. So the seven principles are whole, nestedness, potential, essence, developmental, nodes, and fields. I could explain them more, but one thing that I want to reflect with you, it's maybe how these concepts apply to the Australian context or to the Australian museum context. And what I'm trying to say is that sometimes when you think about nestedness, you have the visitor, you have the neighborhood, you have the community, then you have the city of Sydney, then you have Australia, then you have the planet, right? Of course, when you were doing your work, you were minding this. But I want to hear from you if this rings you a bell when you think about the idea of nestedness, the potential of territory when it meets the essence of this museum, what could happen? So
Yes.
can you think about ideas on how in the Australia context and in the Australian museum context, these regenerative principles resonate?
Yeah, good. No, thanks. That's a good thing to think through. Um, so I guess one of the ways that I feel the Australian Museum is stepping up to some of those principles um, can be, I guess, crystallized through like an example of one project, which really is a sort of expression of a lot of that sort of that key essence of wanting to encourage concepts of regeneration in the general community, which is our Future Now exhibition. And so this is an exhibition which is designed to help people understand our potentials for what we can do for the futures that we can create. It's very positive futures, and that we have what we need now to create the futures we want. We're also just making the point that we actually are creating the future now, that the decisions we make now about how we live are creating our future. So it's really important to recognise that these are important decisions that we make about everyday life. We've made dioramas, so 3 landscapes, human nature landscapes, and they're sort of like the size of a large table, these 3 landscapes, and they're in sort of big glass cases, but they can travel quite easily. And they go to shopping centres and town centres and schools and libraries, and out in towns around New South Wales. And they're little mini like there's a mini town, and there's a house and garden, and then there's a nature landscape with forests and seaweed farms and regenerative farms, and each of them has a lot of little bits of information around, and they're really captivating. But it's kind of like it's a little microcosm of the ideas that I want to get out to people. And I know that people aren't coming to the museum all the time. There's whole parts of our community who don't come to museums. But if I want to reach them, then I need to take my ideas out of the museum and have them in physical form and get them out into a town. So it's kind of like looking at how we don't just have a nesting of audiences within the museum building, that we're trying to create those layers outside the museum's building, and that's the way we can be more effective. But each of those dioramas, I guess, is encouraging people to think about their own place and their own construction of their own town, or their own suburb and their own home, and comparing. So this is how this looks. This is very green town, and it's got trees everywhere, and there's green on all the buildings, growing on all these places, and there's animals, and there's birds, and there's community gardens and farmers markets and all these, and clean technologies, and then helping them to see how this little concept could perhaps be implanted or evolved, or in elements of it could be to be built in their own town. So I guess it's that kind of thinking about how we can, I guess, nest an idea from the museum inside a town, and then hopefully they're talking to other towns, and then these ideas, because we know they do actually. So because we get phone calls from other towns saying, "Oh, we saw the Future Now exhibition," or "My friend told me about the Future Now exhibition in Wagga Wagga. We want to have it in Orange. Can we get it?" And so they are talking to each other, and so that's how we're kind of nesting these ideas in the state of New South Wales. That's the New South Wales state government is the one who pays for the Australian Museum. So we're a state organisation, and then those ideas hopefully in time will you know, percolate up to more national conversations as well. But and that does happen. Like today, I had the most wonderful conversation over lunch with Damon Gameau, who's a filmmaker and passionate advocate for regeneration. I can recommend you look up Damon Gameau, and he has created a film called 2040, and it's a really wonderful feature film. It's like a pseudo documentary, but it's also quite imaginative and uses lots of post-production. You know, it's not just like a straight documentary. It's more, it's helping us, it's providing the architecture for imagination. It's helping us to think ourselves through to 2040 and what it might be like, what it can be like, using just all the technologies and approaches we've got now. How to regenerate.
2040.
2040. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can arrange to see it if you, I'm not quite sure how it works, but anyway, it's, you could probably arrange, I think you might need to like pay a little bit of money
Mm-hmm.
to get it. It's like maybe it wouldn't be very expensive, but you can then download it and watch it. And there's also another one called Regenerating Australia. It's a short piece, a 17-minute film, which is basically set in 2030, and it's celebrating. It's about to be, you know, it's, you know, New Year's Eve 2030, and celebrating all the amazing changes in Australia. And look what we've done. Isn't this great? And so it's like news reports and all sorts of things. So it's like it's sort of an imagined 2029, and saying, look at all what we've done. We've got, you know, we've just had a whole month of, you know, 98% renewable energy in Australia, and we're running on renewables now, and you know, and look at all these things we've done for these communities that needed to be able to help to be transition to the new economy, and all sorts of things that happen. But you know, really looking at regeneration of nature is a key part of that.
I think this
And
part that you were saying is really good, because regeneration has been approached by filmmakers, as you were saying, and documentaries who are trying to demonstrate that we can imagine other futures and
yeah,
and embark more people to these other futures. And I do think regenerative movement, it's also thinking the whole idea of the tipping point where 25% of the population coming together for change movement can actually change our whole scheme of things. And I think, as you're saying, imagination, it's a characteristic, it's a core value of the indigenous cosmology. It's also part of the fiber of how they envision the future by dreaming it. So I just want to ask you a question. In Australia and in the Pacific Islands, a lot of the original people and the people who have been thinking on indigenous pedagogy, indigenous cosmology, are also trying to see how this knowledge can be embraced when we are thinking of projects, when we're thinking of our territories. Can you think about ideas? I'm not sure if it's working with the museum, but in the Australian landscape, where indigenous cosmology have affect the way people were thinking on projects. And do you think this can help museums to correlate more closely to the territories' regeneration?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So I think most of our projects are influenced by First Nations approaches and cosmologies, yeah, ways of thinking and ways of caring for country. So yeah, and I should have acknowledged at the very beginning that I'm on the land of the Darug people of the Eora Nation, land that was stolen and hasn't been returned, and the Australian Museum is on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. So we always acknowledge that when we start on any endeavour, or if we start on a meeting, normally more than just a few people, but normally we'd always acknowledge that and keep that forefront in our mind. We have a very wonderful and generous and patient First Nations team at the Australian Museum. We have a First Nations director, so we have our CEO and director, Kim McKay, but then the director of the First Nations programs and collections, the museum, is Laura McBride, and she's got a growing team, and they've got a lot of influence and capacity within the museum to help us to, you know, make sure that what we're doing is really advancing, you know, deeply connected and thoughtful ways of advancing First Nations approaches. So it's really, yeah, really powerful, and that's what we need to have happen in our institutions much more. I mean, every museum in Australia has First Nations teams. They all have, First Nations people managing the collections. So that's whether there's always going to be, so there'll always be Australian First Nations team members, but there's also often Pacific as well. So certainly at the Australian Museum, we have our Pacifica team. They look after, I think the full title is like Collections and Cultural Connections for the Pacific collections and community. And then then there's the larger First Nations team as well. So, and then there's First Nations.
This closeness, it's really, really good that they are close to the management systems of the museums and they influence the thinking. Have you seen, or do you think this helps the museums professionals to embrace the idea of the equilibrium between humans and non-humans on when we are planning projects and when we are even curating for museums?
Yes, I think it does, definitely. And we're learning from our First Nations colleagues all the time, and whether it's you're hearing about how totemic animals work in their society, and understanding that, as Laura McBride has said, well, really every Australian should have a totemic animal. Perhaps you could have one just gifted to you, a totem gifted to you at birth. That would be a really useful way of helping everyone in Australia to feel really connected to country and understand their responsibilities for stewardship. And I really like that idea. I mean, not everyone who's a First Nations person would agree with that, but I quite like that idea. But certainly in terms of what we do with planning exhibitions and our projects, I know certainly for me, it's always helped me to be able to think about how we're thinking about, our more than human kin, and how we aren't just thinking about people. We're always trying to find ways of talking about people and other species, and I'm always bringing that in. And I'm just trying to think of some of the projects. So we're just redesigning one of our major exhibitions, a permanent gallery. It's called the Australia Gallery, and it's all about. It's focused on wildlife, and it's also incorporating people into that and climate change into that. And we're going to be creating these big, like, trees, like they're going to be made out of. I don't want them to be made out of wood or I don't know something, but large trees with hollows and animals inside them. And but in that same gallery, we're also creating like an apartment, and then lots of animals all around it who live in the urban environment, and so you can see the rich biodiversity in our cities. And then there's a bit about Sydney Harbour, and that's got things that people have been doing to create more habitat and well-being for the animals in Sydney Harbour. So things like living seawalls, which are like these sort of artistic, sort of beautiful shapes, which provide living spaces for marine creatures of all sorts, and so that sort of thing, and also like there's a project called Operation Crayweed, which is trying to regenerate crayweed in Sydney Harbour, because a lot of those, it's very it's a bit like sea grasses and things like that, which are hugely important ecosystems and also massively important for sequestration. So yeah, there's these big projects that some marine biologists have got going in Sydney Harbour to regenerate those sea crayweed meadows. And so we'll be having some of those in the exhibition as well. And there's a whole range of ways that we're showing how we're all interconnected, us and all the other species around us, and we're responsible for each other, and we're responsible for each other's well-being, and I like all the interconnectedness that's weaving in and out of that new gallery. So I think we're doing it much more effectively now than the museum has done in the past.
Yes.
Really. And there's certainly two First Nations team members in a team of about, I suppose, about 10 of us involved in curating this new gallery. And oh no, actually maybe about 8 of us, and yeah, and 2 First Nations team members. So that's really great. One of them's from our education department, and the other one is in the design section. But yeah, so they're really contributing a lot to that. And yeah, there's other exhibitions which our First Nations team just doing on their own, with a huge amount of collaboration with communities in a certain region or whatever. Like there was recently an exhibition about colonisation, and so it was for the anniversary of Captain Cook arriving in Australia. It was called Unsettled. So it's such a good and important exhibition, and that was all about how they spent a long time talking to communities up and down the east coast of Australia where Captain Cook landed, and brought all of that into that really important history exhibition. But it was really all about telling truth to power. So it was very it was confronting but very creative, and huge numbers of really fantastic contemporary artworks, as well as all the archival and historic works as well. So it was really very dramatic, and it won so many awards, and it got so much attention, and it was really a really big moment for museums in Australia, really, that exhibition. So very proud of it.
That's good to know, and hopefully this inspire new generations about being also the custodians of places and taking care of the non-humans that are living in the places. I want to step back now and ask you about the Sustainable Development Framework, thinking about the SDGs. I was gonna check with you and ask if the Australian Museum is applying the Sustainable Development Framework and has been applying the Agenda 2030, and how is this happening through the programs and through the activities and through the mindset of the museum? And what is your views about the Sustainable Development Framework?
Yeah, thanks. So we have applied the Sustainable Development Goals across the museum. So we had a consultant come in to help us with it, and she sat down with us, and there was a core team working on doing that. So the person who's she's got a lot of oversight for the governance of the museum and government relations and First Nations reconciliation and all these big sort of policies. So she works at that policy level for the museum, plus me, and also our sustainability strategy coordinator. And so it was mostly us working through what it was that you could see. It was sort of mapping the SDGs to what the museum does already, but really wanting to see that the goals that we select as being our core goals that we're trying to advance. We ended up with 6 core goals. We wanted to make sure that these were going to be inspirational and helping to advance work towards those goals. So I think we did really well with the mapping, and the goals we selected are all really apt and good, relevant goals for us. But what we haven't done yet is the really embedding it into the consciousness of the staff of the museum as yet. And I think there's a number of reasons why that happened, partly to do with the key people who are running it having to be pulled away on other projects and so on. So it's just that sort of the capacity to really get the messaging out and really encourage people and engage people across the museum hasn't really happened yet. And I feel that this is something, it will happen, but at the moment the goals they're not really doing the work that they could be doing for the Australian Museum. So we've achieved lots of things, but I think we would have achieved them anyway. So things like, we've gone carbon neutral. At least we've said we're now carbon neutral, but we're buying some offsets. So we're still working towards being net zero, but we're not there yet. And we're we're certainly attending to life below water and life on land and of course climate action is what I'm working on all the time. But these are all things that, yes, we're doing these things anyway already. So our scientists are all working on understanding and helping to support wildlife conservation, marine conservation and terrestrial. And we're also working, we have many partnerships for the goals. I mean, we have many partnerships through our work and so on. So it's just, I think it's helpful for us to be able to remind people that there's the SDGs, these are important goals for us all to be working towards. But I don't know that it's helping us to do things differently necessarily. So yeah, I think there's more work to be done in that regard. Yeah.
Yes, I want to go a little bit deeper in this. So regenerative thinkers believe that sustainable development, it's a great path in terms of bringing more positive actions and also, as we said, reducing the damage and starting doing more good for the territory. But there is an equation that it's hard to achieve, which is the commitment to continue economic growth. As you know, one of the SDGs, the 8th SDGs, talks about economic growth, although with equity, although with just relations, it's still, in some places, degrowth may be needed instead of more economic growth. Another thing is to think about that when we're seeking to build a healthier systems, we may need to reverse patterns of the systems, and we cannot only think about sustaining the patterns of the system. We need to look into what has been damaged and then look into a possibility of bring regenerative development instead of sustainable development. There is also an epistemological way of thinking, and the fact that by doing that, we may drive the mindset much more aligned to the reconciliation, to the restoration, to the reconstruction, instead of trying to sustain some patterns that unconsciously it's leading us to continue damaging and to continue having exhaustion of the system. So I just want to hear if you have any considerations about how this criticism and those all the ideas of course, considering the SDGs as part of the equation, and it's a very important step, but minding the fact that maybe we need a regenerative lenses to deliver the sustainable development goals. What do you think about this?
I agree. I absolutely agree. And I've always been a little uncomfortable about the sustainability narrative around the SDGs and the development, particularly sustainable development. I haven't always been like, development's not necessarily what we all need, and it's not. It seems counterintuitive to me to be always talking about development when exactly we do need to be certainly considering degrowth in the West, and then supporting whatever kind of regeneration we can here, but also in parts of the world that need that kind of support at this point, because of what we've done to their economies and their environments and all the extractivism and the impacts of that. But yeah, I guess I've always felt that it wasn't quite the right lens, that regeneration seems to be what we need to be really immersing ourselves in and thinking about and supporting. It's a much more, it just seems that that's what's the most powerful lens that we could be using at this point.
That's good.
Powerful approach,
Yeah, it's just your initial reflections on this. I want to talk about the notion of place. Regeneration and regenerative thinkers believe we can perhaps heal and care for places. And it's very important that we look for more specific solutions rather than generic solutions when we're thinking about regeneration. I'm trying to find some quotes here that could inspire us from the regenerative thinking. So, for example, Understanding place as a whole, encompassing our living beings, giving us an opportunity to heal, is one of the things of the Regenesis Institute. Another one is to say, place, it's a doorway into caring. And also, I think this is a beautiful way of thinking. And here it says, no one can make ecological good sense of the planet. Everyone can make ecological good sense locally. If the affection, the scale, the knowledge, the tools, and the skills are right. This is Endel Berry. And another thing also we could think about is the ground for regenerative development is an understanding of place. What makes each place unique? What gives its vitality, viability? What is the source of its potential? And therefore, its capacity to evolve. With this understanding, it becomes possible to tailor sustainable design, the strategies and processes that are harmonious with the character of a specific place. So I want to bring you to the discussion of the notion of place for the museum's context. And I saw some of the research projects you have been doing about, I could name here, conceiving biocultural resilience with the Pacific Islands communities. You say bridging principles, language, and culture. And another one that I have seen, you mentioned that the whole idea of the biocultural resilience. So regenerative development practitioners, they believe that bioculturalism is fundamental to commit to the transformation of a place by understanding the patterns of a specific territory. So the nodal interventions of regenerative development, it's basically recognize the patterns of the territory, a place, which is very much a community-based knowledge, and then moving from there to relearn what kind of interventions we could do to restore these patterns that will bring life back to the territory. And then perhaps this territory can regenerate itself. As we said, it's a principle that it's there, but it's how we as human beings interact with these principles and patterns that may help regeneration to recap its own pattern, its one way of being. So I want to ask you, how do you believe museums can act regeneratively based on their places, their bioregions, their biocultural context where they're rooted with?
Thank you. These are such great questions. I've got, I think, like four things to sort of explore around that. So, in particular cases. So I think you're absolutely right that really drilling in and understanding those biocultural relationships in a particular place and seeing how a museum can encourage people to think locally and to really understand all those interrelationships in their own place is really important. And certainly, like, our own scientists at the museum in the Australian Museum Research Institute are all working on, you know, really tracking particular species in particular places and helping people to understand what's happening, you know, with climate change impacts on those species and what we can do to support them. And so all that work is, you know, certainly one side of what the museum is doing. But in terms of the more cultural side of things, and what we're doing when we're engaging with different parts of our community, there's, I guess what I see the museum doing is, I mean, not necessarily like getting out there into those places and saying, I think this is what you need to do to try and regenerate your place, but rather like sort of trying to open doors for people. And so the sorts of things that I've been doing, just a few examples. One of them is a program called Coffee and Climate, which is a small, safe space conversation, you know, just around a table in our members' lounge, and it happens once a month. And it's a chance for people to, like, you know, raise questions and talk and share something, learn something, and leave with more reasons for hope. But at the beginning of that, I'll say to people as we're going around the group, I'll just say, so, you know, tell us your name and tell us why you've come this morning, and also tell me a place that's special to you that you want to protect. Because I want people to have, and I'll say, just, you keep that in your heart and in your mind as a place that you want to protect this place. It's something that will help as a sort of a talisman or as a guide or as a is something that's drawing you forward to take action. And it's always really beautiful because people have these beautiful reflections about, well, actually, I do love where I am, but the place that I really want to protect is, where we go every summer, with my family, and we go here to this particular beach, and then they start talking about it and they evoke it for everyone else, and it's this really lovely way of seeing people's interconnections with these places and other species that live there, and it's just sort of springing those thoughts of how we can help to protect those places, and how you might, as an ordinary citizen, step up to that kind of responsibility, because I don't think that's a common thought at all here in Australia anyway. It's just not, unless you're a person of country, unless you're if there's a mob, First Nations mob, then you're just not, it's not in the common narrative to think about how can we protect this place necessarily. There's lots of people who join environment groups and so on, but for most people it just doesn't happen. So that's one little small practice, but hopefully sparking ideas for people. And then another thing that I'm wanting to set up is a map, which is mapping. It's an interactive map which will go on our website, and it will be helping people to interact with all the place-based things that are happening around them, regenerative practices, or all sorts of things. So like whether it's a community microgrid that the town has just set up, or it's a replanting trees in an area that has been was a farmland, just degraded farmland before, or it's a tool sharing facility, or whatever it might be, that a community can get onto the map and put in a little pin where they are and put up a photo and description and a link, and that means that you start to get a landscape which is populated by people doing regenerative things, things that will be helping to create flourishing, safer, more sustainable futures. And that does a couple of things. It helps people to see who they could get in touch with to learn from. So someone in a town who wants to set up a microgrid can see, oh, there's a few towns over there in northern New South Wales who've done it already. I'm going to get in touch with them and learn from them how they did it, so I don't have to reinvent the wheel. And it also shows people how much is going on around them that's positive and is working in this towards creating the transformation we need. And so it'd be very generative of hope. And so I'm really excited about it. It's just a simple sort of thing. It's using
And I
a
think
model.
it's great when you mention asking people what are the places they care for, because so Regenesis Institute is one of the organizations that has been working with regeneration in territories, in urbanism, in designing projects for cities, for different for reimagining a different way of thinking of urban development. And they always say they need to start with the story of a place. And the story of a place, it's a mixture of what people feel about this place. And they may have different angles, but they all care for the place in different ways. So how do we then bring them together to a common regenerative project? But you need to start where they are and what their connections are. And so I think it's perfect. It is a regenerative practice, what you are doing, by asking people of what the stories they want to safeguard and to make sure that they are kept in the territory that they care. So I think it's really, really, it's a regenerative way of looking at the climate change and the eco-anxiety as well in a different way. So
Exactly.
it's very, very interesting. Sorry, can you comment?
Oh yeah, no, that's right. So I was going to say the other thing, the other example I wanted to give you was a research project that we're currently developing with some university collaborators. So we'll be putting in a grant application. So it's not like it's a project which is happening yet, but it's in formation. And so we were approached by colleague and friend at the University of Technology, Sydney, and we're going to be just basing this project in Sydney Harbour and Sydney's waterways. And so it's looking at Sydney Harbour over time and the different I guess, relationships that have grown up around Sydney Harbour over time. And so it'll go archaeologically, looking at First Nations habitation and connections to Sydney Harbour. And then with colonisation, we've got historians on the project as well as archaeologists. And then there's marine biologists working on how Sydney Harbour's ecology has changed over time and how we can trace all those stories. And then there'll be people like me working with our museum collections and seeing how what we've got in our collections helps us to understand those changing relationships with different communities with Sydney Harbour, and then how people are thinking about the harbour now and into the future, what we're imagining it might be like in the future with sea level rise, with warming the waters. We're starting to get coral like growing near the harbour, so it's like so we're losing the Great Barrier Reef, but we're starting to get coral growing down here. So but we're getting also many invasive species because the waters are warmer and they can overwinter now in these areas. And so there's lots of change going on because of climate change, and it's just tapping into how people and other species are really experiencing those changes. And it's going, so the grant would be supporting us to work for several years on creating these understandings, these really rich stories from many different perspectives, people from many different backgrounds, and then the archive of all those collections that we have in the museum as well to help us get some of those stories from animals, invertebrates and vertebrates and insects and birds and all those things, all those different inhabitants of our waters. And it's really exciting. I hope we get the grant, so it would be really wonderful. So but a very, very, it's all about place. How do we, kind of one of the key research questions is how can we use place-based histories to help us understand changing experiences of Sydney Harbour over time, using the museum and all the people and collections involved in it. So
It's interesting to think about this because the regenerative movement believes that all institutions are under transition to a different model that minds regeneration in the place and how they understand how these places have been affected by the change that we're facing. So, for example, in Australia, there's a whole discussion about the ocean rising. So the fact that how heating is affecting Australia. So there are things that are specifically related to the concerns of the population, but not necessarily people find ways of linking to what they can do, how they can transform their habits to change this reality. So the notion of place is very important to activate what they can do for this place to regenerate itself. I want also to hear you, Jenny, the notion of place in museums, as we know, it's very important to think about that not only the places where museums are located, but the places that museums represent. So I want to bring the notion between decolonization and regenerative development or regenerative thinking, because one of the things that is very thoughtful, and we have been thinking on regenerative principles applied to museums, is the notion of repatriation, restitution of objects, and how these systems where these objects were taken from have been the impact that has been created. It's so huge that has created dysfunctionality of the ecosystems where these objects have been taken from. So what I want to hear from you is if you can see the possibility of regenerative thinking help us to reflect on how, by giving back these objects to the communities, and depending how we do it, we are acting regeneratively by minding the functionality and vitality we're bringing back to this system from where these objects belong to.
That's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't actually put those two things together, but you're absolutely right. It is supportive of regeneration, that sort of support for cultural practice and and reconciliation. So I guess the Australian Museum has had a really active repatriation program for Aboriginal Australian ancestors since the 1980s, and that's been done very carefully and slowly. There's always been a repatriation officer who's a First Nations person working directly with communities to sort of see how and when and and what will be repatriated, and just in the way the community wants that to happen, rather than us imposing anything. And so it's been happening for a long time. And then what's happened more recently is starting the process of repatriating ancestors to the Pacific. And so there's just been this huge repatriation of Tongan ancestors to Tonga that involved a big funeral ceremony that the royal family attended, and was really very, very important, very powerful, extremely, I guess regenerative experience for Tonga. They have lost so much, particularly recently with cyclones and volcanoes and all these things happening, and lots of things is being stripped away. To have a really important gift of ancestors returning. Do you call that a gift? I don't know. It's a replenishing, or it's a return of revered ancestors, and and unknown ancestors, and just they brought so some coffins were made. In fact, as the Tongans asked for that to happen, and so I think it was about maybe 8 or 9 coffins were made, and so the remains were placed inside and returned and buried. So it was very important process, and that kind of starting the process of healing is of course hugely important. And I think most museums recognise that that's an important process that has to take place. We can't be holding that up or trying to stop that or anything. That's, I think most museums would recognise that, of course, ancestors certainly, but also ancestral objects can often go back as well very usefully. I think it takes a very self-assured museum to let cultural objects go back as well. I know places like this, there are a few institutions in Britain, one that I used to work for, that's very uncomfortable at the idea of cultural objects being repatriated. But given that a lot of them are actual ancestors, I think that those under that banner of repatriating ancestors, they should also be going back. But I think you're right. Absolutely, it is a really important part of it.
And it's good to hear from you the initiatives that has been taken from the Australian Museum, because one of the regeneration principles is the fields of energy. Is the fact that place contains fields of energy, and if you think about the sacredness of these objects, when they go back to this whole that they are part of, they may restore different cycles of energy that we don't know. Of course, this is part of the indigenous cosmology, of way of looking at the systems, but they do understand that the objects contain energy, and by doing this, you're also restoring a field of energy that may be contribute to the regenerative thinking and process of this territory. Thank you for this reflection. I want to think about now the leadership, the facilitation within the museum sector to lead regenerative projects. Of course, you are there in a big institution. You were doing this work of building more awareness, activating visitors to commit to change. It's not an easy task. So I want to bring you the notion of regenerative leadership. So the regenerative thinkers believe that for an organization to be regenerative, it requires individuals who are committed to their self-development. and who are committed to embark to a journey that will look into more eco skills, more holistic values. It may include the notion of understanding what generosity, compassion, conflict mediation, peacemaking, activism, and other things may coexist. And this requires also the idea of creating a more consciousness about why we are doing what we are doing in museums. So you have been leading various efforts in terms of addressing climate change, promoting the development of solutions. I think you're also providing support for raising awareness about climate change and implementing ideas of how people can address eco-anxiety. So do you see room for museums to embark this learning that includes the museum's professionals to look in a different way of their role, but also to understand this literacy, this capacity that regeneration requires? And I want to bring you one quote here of the Regenesis group that says, "We must bring our whole selves to the task. We must transform from the spoilers to co-evolvers. To be agents of transformation, designers must transform themselves. They must redesign their own thinking and ways of being. In other words, regenerative development requires inner work."
Yes. Oh, I so agree. I so agree. These are wonderful quotes. If you could send the quotes through to me, that'd be great. I'll have to do more reading, but that's absolutely it. And I feel that I am enabled to help, like our audience members, our communities, to be thinking about that inner work, and I can have those kinds of conversations. But I'm not yet really feeling enabled to help my colleagues at the Australian Museum necessarily. It's kind of like it would be stepping outside the bounds of my role, maybe to be doing that. But maybe I need to rethink that a bit, actually. Because why not? I think actually people are always really interested to hear from me with information about ways they can be, taking action to, how do we get, how do we find a way to hire or to lease an electric car, or to move our money to more ethically based banks and superannuation companies and things. They want that kind of information, but I wonder if maybe they'd be up for thinking a bit more about the kind of work that, the internal work that we need to be doing as well. They might be. It's certainly something I should be thinking a bit more about. I have done that for peers like beyond the Australian Museum, because a really important part of just everyday life, I guess, as a museum worker here in Sydney, is that I've been setting up really nice connections and mutual support for other people in cultural institutions who are concerned about climate change and want to do more. And so we've got a group that we've called Sydney Cultural Institutions for Climate Action, and we meet monthly, and it's been a really lovely support group and sharing ideas group, and we're all good friends now. Like, it started off just we'd have coffee together once a month, and then it sort of became a bit more developed, and we decided we'd have taken turns to have excursions around each other's institutions, and we have people come in and give us talks on different aspects, different subjects and things that we're interested in. And so, but the really important part of that group is not just what we're learning about, how we can, do better climate communications or engage people in different ways, or how to, have more sustainable operations. It's much more that we can go to each other. Like, when the latest IPCC report comes out, we'll all be like, talking to each other, saying, "Oh my God, how are you going?" We're texting each other saying, "How are you feeling today?" And, "I know this is a hard day." And our colleagues around us at the institutions we're in don't necessarily understand those kinds of highs and lows that we're experiencing. And it's just really nice to have someone who does understand, and you can just say, "How are you going? Just having a glass of red wine to try and help get through this." And And that sort of sympathy and understanding is really important. And we also give each other courage, because if you hear that, oh, actually that other institution, they've managed to get their executives to recognise how important it is to actually have a full-time sustainability officer, then you can mention that to your own CEO and you sort of think, oh, actually, do you know, this is what they've done over at the Opera House? And then your own CEO goes, oh, really? Okay. And so it starts to, it gives you that sort of way of trying to step up the ladder and to increase the efforts of your own institution, because you can see that there's parallels and examples you can bring into conversations and things that will motivate your own executives. So that's really helpful in all sorts of ways. And I've also been trying to establish more of those kinds of connections with people working in museums and galleries across Australia, so having a more national conversation. So we did, under the banner of Action for Climate Empowerment, part of the Paris Agreement, as we all know, thanks to Henry McGee, really trying to help people recognise that that's a key part of what Australia has to deliver on. And I've been talking to people in the federal government here who are responsible for reporting on Action for Climate Empowerment, and they're thrilled that there's museums talking about it, because not many people here in Australia ever talk about Action for Climate Empowerment. And so we're able to say this is what we're doing in museums in Australia. We've had conference discussions and workshops and so on to try and pull together some of the information about what it is that we're doing, and feeding that up to that sort of intergovernmental level of reporting. So we had a poster that was shown at the Bonn Intersessional last year, and then the Australian Museum sent some digital content, some interactives and things that we have to the Australian Pavilion in Dubai, so to COP in Dubai. So we went to COP28, and things like that are helpful as well. But sort of working on all those different levels. But I think you're right about the work that we need to do internally, and I need to probably give that some more thought.
I'm glad you mentioned the network and the idea of being between peers. Of course, regenerative thinking is a task that not necessarily it's a common sense in Anthropocene era. And also, I think we were very much trained to have a mechanicist way of thinking. And when you ask people to enter vulnerability, to then relearn things that are not in the common sense, it's a personal journey as well. And I think it helps when we go in together and we find common challenge and similar barriers, ways of overcoming it. I think not me, but the regenerative movement, it's a movement of collective minds and hearts and hands all together. And we must feel we're not alone. Otherwise, we couldn't deal with such a complex complexity of this task that we're having in the front of us of facing social and climate collapse. So I'm glad you mentioned the network support.
Yeah, thanks. And that's sort of the importance of stepping into collectives and supporting collectives is the thing that I'm saying all the time to people, no matter what I'm doing. It's always like, this is it. We need to upscale our power. We're stronger together. All these things. It's what I'm saying all the time. It's just so true. We just have to make sure we're all working together, and that people can find the collective that suits them the best. Like whenever I'm having these discussions with people, the general public, and they're saying things, well, what can I do? What's the best thing I could do? I'll say, well, join a collective. Yeah, so have a look around. If you're a parent, there's Parents for Climate Action. If you're a surfer, there's Surfers for Climate Action. There's vets and doctors and all these different groups you can join. And young people have got their own groups, and they're all working towards these same goals. And it's just there'll be a group for you out there. So just find your people.
Yes. We were colleagues at the ICOM Sustain. We were colleagues at the Sustainable Working Group, the Sustainable Development Working Group for ICOM. And this is part of that. It's creating a culture of not only capacity building, but a network of people within the sector thinking on how sustainability and sustainable development, it is an important path to think about how we regenerate territories It's part of the equation, and we were there together as well.
Okay. Yes, it is lovely.
Yeah.
It truly gives me lots of hope, and yeah, it's a really lovely thing. Mm.
I think I have two final questions,
Okay.
if I may, if you still have
Oh,
time.
yes, yes, absolutely.
So, in terms of the frameworks, we were talking about the indigenous cosmology, which is great and inspiring us. But then, when we sit into projects and we start strategic thinking, annual plans, and when we start in doing all the KPIs that museums all need to do, we come into bottom line discussions. And one of the things that regenerative thinkers have developed and practitioners, it's frameworks to help these leaders to bring the voice of nature to the projects. So I could explain you some of the frameworks, but we don't need to go into details. But if you want to look at I think it's 50th Conservatory of Botanical Garden in the US, they have placed an article in the book that Nick Merriman just added,
Oh, yes.
and you have your article there as well.
Yeah.
So Richard Piacentini, he mentions how they are applying three of the regenerative frameworks.
Oh, yes.
One of them is called Three Lines of Work. The other one is the Living System Stakeholders. And the third one is the Law of Three. We
Oh,
are not going to details, but what I want to ask you is, when we are doing strategic planning in museums, do you think would that be helpful if we bring
mm.
nature as one of the stakeholders? And then
Oh,
imagine
yeah.
if we are there, we are doing the strategic planning for anything. It could be curatorship, education, programming, conservation. But then
Yeah.
we have nature on the table
Yeah, great.
as a
Mm.
framework, as part of the equation. Would that be helpful?
I think it would. I think it would. I don't know what it would take for our museums to actually do that seriously, but that would help. It really would. I Yeah,
Have
I
you
think it would.
seen this
Yeah.
happening in any project, or just by having these discussions with museums professionals, and then you would say, okay, so let's look from this angle of the
Yeah,
nature, and how would that shift our perspective on this project?
exactly. I'm wondering. I think maybe Nicole Heller at or maybe she's at Phipps. No, where is she? She's at Carnegie. She's at Carnegie in the States. Carnegie Museum, Natural History Museum. I think maybe she's been doing some of that with her projects, and I haven't been in touch with her for years. Actually, I must talk to her again. But I think that's exactly the kind of thing that she's been doing with her specific projects. And I think yeah, just we had a strategy meeting for the museum yesterday, and I wished perhaps we'd had the talk the night before, because then I could have brought that concept in. As it is, we yeah, it's interesting because we're a natural history museum too, and we've got, you know, nature right there up front and personal, and it's, you know, it's really core to what we're doing. And I'd suggested some wording for a key pillar of the strategy, which was like, basically, we are here in support of nature and society, and, you know, this is why we're doing these things, and blah blah blah. And then lots of people are sort of going, well, I don't know, in support of, I don't know, that it's not very, like, it doesn't sound very exciting, or it's not really, I wouldn't be able to sell that idea to donors. I think, well, we want something which is really going to grab people's imagination. And I was thinking, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe we need a better word than support. I don't know whether it's like protect, or whether it's, I don't know, maybe it's something, regenerate probably would have been better. But I don't know, that might have been taking things a bit too far for that particular audience. But maybe I think I'll suggest it. I'll suggest regenerate nature and community, and see if that's something that would run with them. But I had a sense that they were, I don't know, just like even thinking about like support, maybe, yeah, it wasn't exciting enough as a mission. So I don't know whether supporting nature is what they see we're doing. I'm not sure. I don't know. A lot of the scientists are just there to like study species and sort of do taxonomies, you know, figure out what is out there and document them. and our First Nations teams are all working on supporting people and culture, and I don't know if they necessarily would see their job to also extend to be supporting nature per se. I mean, they're very concerned about climate change. They want to help communities to, you know, cope culturally as well as, you know, in terms of all sorts of well-being. But I don't think they necessarily see what they're doing as being like trying to regenerate nature necessarily. So yeah, I think it's very interesting. I know our digital would be very keen to have regeneration in the wording of any strategy at the Australian Museum, and she's very keen on rewilding as well. So it's nice to have an ally in there. But yeah, no, thanks for helping me think that through. Actually, that is really important. Yeah, thanks. And having a role for nature as one of our stakeholders, and someone who nature as, because I mean, I think the thing is nature is us, so it's a bit hard to have a dividing line, but we've still got those dividing lines, so we need to just broaden out what we understand as being nature. So anyway.
I'm really glad you brought this, because the regeneration movement and the regenerative mindset, it's there not only for museums, as we said. Lots of institutions have been thinking what the role could be, and this goes in the center of revisiting their mission, their purpose, and their vision. So when you mention what is the proper word, if it's support or regenerate, I think it's crucial, it's important.
Yes, it is.
But one thing that I would recommend, the book from Carol Sanford, it's called The Regenerative Life. Carol Sanford, she was responsible for systematizing a lot about the regenerative paradigms and how it sits into corporations, organizations, and institutions that have these institutional documents, and important of how they guide our principles. And one of the things that she says is that we cannot add the word regenerative to everything by not minding how does that transform our way of working. We need to include regeneration and regenerative thinking if we are clear what does it mean for the organization, right? So there is a whole movement now of regenerative industry, regenerative agriculture. It's essential and it's important, but it has been used by corporations in different ways that not necessarily means regeneration. So I think it's so for example, we can talk about urban regeneration. It has been used for many years, especially from the museums industry as well, when they come to a place and then there's this all urban regeneration in the territory where the museum is installed. But not necessarily this urban regeneration is the same regeneration we are talking here, because not always this urban regeneration have mind the nature degradation when they were being developed. They were very much focused on economical development, and they're not necessarily were taking into consideration the climate injustice that was happening there, or the environmental racism that was happening there. So sometimes regeneration has been used for other purpose, other ways of understanding. But I think it's critical what you're saying in terms of bringing regeneration to the equation of the vision and the core mission of the museums. But it requires a deeper understanding of how actually this museum regenerates the territory where it's based. And so I would recommend Carol Sanford podcast about a truth regeneration, regenerative approach when it decides to enter to this. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how it evolves.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, I've written some notes there.
Yeah, I think my final point now, it's really just your final thought about what specific contribution museums from Australia, the Pacific Island can bring to planet's regeneration. So this last question, it's less about how regenerative thinking can bring life back to museums to then relearn to regenerate. It's more about the major contribution that museums can give to the movement of regeneration, which has long-term view of helping Earth regeneration as we evolved, as when we think about individuals, visitors, so billions of visitors visit 100,000 museums. So when we think about the potential of museums embracing the regenerative movement, we can think about a major change. So I want to hear from you what the Australia or Pacific Islands museums can do for planet's regeneration before we finished.
That's a great big question. So I think one of the key things that Australian and Pacific museums can offer up is that really crucial foundational set of First Nations approaches, and very specific to this region. So all that diversity of approach and all that deep knowledge over millennia. So that's, I think, becoming more clearly expressed through museums and other cultural institutions in this region. And there's a lot that I think can be learned from those voices, those elders, those experts, those powerful storytellers around the rest of the world. There's also really wonderful things going on around rethinking the story here. So one of the things I'm really excited about over the next little while is providing new types of stories that we can tell through the museum. The strapline for the Climate Solutions Centre is Powerful Stories for Positive Futures, and we're really thinking deeply about those kinds of stories and who, we want to make sure that these are very grounded in what's going on around the country, people working from many different backgrounds, people who are on the land, they're farmers, they're people who are, trying to rebuild after floods or severe fires, or people who are working on creating stronger communities in all sorts of ways, people who are regenerating nature of all sorts, and just making sure those stories get told through our museums, through our exhibitions and our web resources and our events and so on. And I think that kind of storytelling, which is really very very vivid and diverse, making sure we've got a huge diversity is really important. It's something museums are so well placed to do. We're interesting to people from many different backgrounds and many different walks of life and ages and geographic locations. So because we're interesting to so many people, we can connect to those people, and also finding new ways of connecting to those people who maybe aren't interested in museums, but we're working on that. And we can sort of seed these conversations and provide platforms for all these diverse voices. So that's another thing. And then there's the other part about that storytelling is we've got connections to really innovative storytellers, either the Pacific orators who've got that huge tradition of oration, who can just, with their very powerful, very clear storytelling, very gentle but strong storytelling, really captivate audiences all around the world. And we see that when Pacific Islanders go to COP and they're speaking there, and are often, creating huge change. That's it's because of Pacific Island orators that we had the 1.5 goal set. It wouldn't have been 1.5. It would have been 2 at Paris otherwise. So we can really see the power of those voices. And we're about to have an event at the museum for hundreds of people that will be, it's our annual oration, and we have a young Pacific Islander woman speaking at that about taking the climate battle to the International Court of Justice that she and fellow law students have been doing. It's incredible. So those kinds of stories are important. But the other kinds of storytellers we have access to at the museum are people like Damon Gameau, who are filmmakers and actors and just storytellers, supreme storytellers. And one of the things that really struck me with the conversation I had with Damon Gameau today at lunch was, he said, I'd been talking to him about this new gallery we're developing and the kinds of sort of the flow of time that I'm wanting to show in it with either digitally or through murals or something like that, like where we are now and the sort of climate disaster that we have now, but then what we can do, how we can move beyond that and create this incredible place to live in, and incredible nurturing, regenerated place, for us, and lots of nature all around us, but the technology there as well, and all these great things which we can picture there on the wall. And you're saying, oh, but because you're doing that flow of time, wouldn't it be wonderful to be reflecting on all those shifting baselines that we have and show the moment before now, and depict some of those incredible abundance we used to have in the world, and so show the huge flocks of birds, and the huge the fish, the big schools of fish that would go for 6 miles, and the bison, or maybe not, we wouldn't use bison, we'd use an Australian example, but anyway, go and look at the historic record and capture some of those, the masses of the numbers of that hugely abundant landscape, the hugely abundant nature we used to have, and show that to people so they can see, okay, we were there, we're now living in this incredibly depleted world, and that's been our doing, so let's now work back to that abundance. And it was just like, yes, let's do that. And it really spoke as well to, I'd already had in my drawing that I'd been doing for this sketch of what I'd like the gallery to be like, I'd already put above this reimagined, beautiful future urban space, huge numbers of trees, and it looks like a bit like a forest. And then above it, masses and masses of birds. And that's because in a talk by Victor Stephenson not so long ago, who's a very powerful First Nations cultural teacher. He's been teaching people about cultural burning and fire practice, healing, and nurturing fire practice to heal country. It's a way of keeping balance on country. Anyway, so his thing is cultural burning, but he gave this talk at the Powerhouse Museum not so long ago in their 100 Climate Conversations series that I was at. And he finished it up, someone asked, the journalist asked him, so what's your vision of the future? And he said, when I look to the future, I can see us in this beautiful place. It's, there's just trees and plants and flowers and insects and animals everywhere. And you look up and there's high technology. It's really technologically advanced, but everything's quiet and clean and lovely. And then you look up, and you can hardly see the sky because it's just full of birds. And I thought, yes. And he said, that's how it used to be. And of course, and he knows that because all those stories have been passed down through generations to him. But a white fella like me doesn't know that. And so to have that vision, it's just like, it could be like that. It could be like that again. It's wonderful. And it brought me to tears. And I just thought, I want to convey that idea to our audiences, to the people who come to the museum as well. So I think that's what we'll do.
I think it's so beautiful, this conversation about bring more optimism and imaginative ways of thinking on museums, which resonate a lot with the idea that I just want to bring it to you. I'm conscious of our time, otherwise we would discuss more, but it's the notion of deep ecology. You talked a lot about things that people could see and you could show, the museums could show, and the stories could be told. So Joanna Macy is one of the thinkers who tell us the notion of deep ecology, which is basically the idea of people experiencing ecology. And there's a whole movement of thinking on regenerative thinking museums by inviting museums to construct ways that people and visitors can experience ecology and feel it. And one of the things that Joanna Macy says is that in order for people to commit to change, they need to have a contact with the deep sorrow of the earth, with the deep pain. But right after, if you come to gratitude and the notion of abundance that you're saying, you find your unique way to contribute for change. So I think it's just an invitation for us in museums to think about how we go beyond just the narratives and the exhibitions, but we also bring experiences. And I'm sure you're doing this. And one of the things you said in terms of the climate talks, it's
Oh, yeah.
about bringing people together to talk about it, to experience, and not only to think, but to feel what's happening, right? So I want to bring the quote from Joanna Macy for us to finish, if that's okay for you,
Yeah.
which is, I think it's very much resonates to what the conversation you had in the lunch today. So active hope, active hope is waking up to the beauty of life on whose behalf we can act. We belong to this world, the web of life. It's calling us forth at this time. We have come a long way, and here we are to play our part. With active hope, we realize that there are adventures in store, strengths to be discovered, and comrades to link arms with. Active hope is a readiness to discover the strengths in ourselves and in others, a readiness to discover the reasons for hope and the occasions for love. So this is Joanna Macy,
That's so beautiful.
and
Yeah.
so this is just
And put that in
remind
our
us
gallery
that
too. That's so good.
acting regeneratively, it's acting on behalf of life and on behalf of love. It's the
Yes.
culture of caring, it's the culture of healing, it's the culture of caring so much that we went into a journey of self-development and we co-evolve with the territory by learning together, right? So we are on a learning journey.
So true. And that's so beautiful, Lucimara. Thank you. Love
Thank you.
that.
And I think you bring active hope, Jenny. I think you're here because you bring active hope. And I'm really glad you participate in this research. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your contribution, not only your contribution to the research, but your contribution to the planet by doing what you're doing. I'm going to update you on the progress of the research and inform you about when the report will be released and the other outcomes of this project and who has been involved. Just want to give you a minute if you want to say any final words, but before I do this, I just want to remind, I am Lucimara Letelier, Research in Regenerative Museums of the University of Leicester Museum Studies. This was an interview with Jenny Newell, curator for climate change in the Australian Museum, and who has been doing a wonderful work and who has been contributed to us as a community to think how museums can act more regeneratively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, so much, so much. It's just been lovely and a really important conversation for me. So thank you so much for all you've shared with me and helped me to learn. So thank you. Lots for me to think about actually out of today's conversation. So thank you. And I'd love to to read over those quotes that you shared. Thank you, and just to reflect on those. So yeah, and if you could send them through, that'll also help me with to guide my reading and further thoughts on regenerative practice in the museum.
Perfect. The report out of this research will contain the literature that endorses the research and will make available to the museum sector to continue researching and learning and getting to the regenerative movement. Thank you.
Thank you for all the work you're doing. It's so important. It's really wonderful.